Millions of Americans could soon be forced out of their homes. A federal eviction moratorium is set to expire at the end of the year. The protections were initially part of the CARES Act, which Congress passed back in March, but those expired at the end of July. The CDC stepped in after Congress failed to reach a new stimulus deal. Using its authority under the Public Health Service Act, the CDC put a new ban on evictions. Now that ban is set to expire on December 31st. For more, I'm joined by CBS News Money Watch reporter Irina Ivanova. Thank you so much for joining us, Irina. Today, how many Americans are we talking about that could lose their homes in the coming months?
There have been some estimates out on this, and they're a little bit all over the place, but we're talking about millions and millions of people potentially in any situation. Just last week, we saw a report from the University of Arizona and the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. They looked at census data, and they figured that about 7 million, nearly 7 million households could be evicted at the end of this year. That translates into about 20 million people. Now, for perspective, 7 million is roughly the number of foreclosures that we saw during the 9 years after the housing bubble and the Great Recession that followed. But again, that was a 9-year period. What we're looking at now potentially is a Great Recession-scale crisis in a much, much shorter time.
You know, I have a friend who works for the county here in LA who says a lot of people just don't understand what their rights are, and so they feel that they have to leave, and then many times they don't. Is the situation improving, or has it gotten worse since the height of unemployment back in April? What are you seeing?
The numbers, unfortunately, are not optimistic. The Census Bureau runs a survey every few weeks. They ask people about their financial situation, and what we've seen since late summer is it has gotten worse. The number of people who say that they're not confident they can pay their rent or mortgage on time has increased. So as of the start of November, there were about 11 million households who said they would not be able to pay their rent or their mortgage on time. And something else that came up in this National Low-Income Housing Coalition report is that even among those people who are managing to make payments, a lot of them are really just scraping it together. They're doing things like dipping into their savings, or they're using credit cards, or they're asking friends or relatives for help. These are not people who you can expect to be able to pay their rent, long term.
Yeah, there's no long-term solution here, it seems like. In your article, you talked about renters facing a payment cliff. Can you explain to us what that means?
Sure. So as you mentioned, Jamie, there is currently a federal ban on evictions, and a number of states have also put in different kinds of moratoria on evictions. But what that means is it's very specific. It means you can't be physically removed from your home over not paying rent. You are still required to pay your rent. And in a lot of these moratoria, actually, your landlord can still go through the eviction process. They can file papers. They can take you to court. They just can't do that final step of physically removing you from the house. A lot of renters are currently finding themselves really behind on rent. So even though they are physically protected for the time being from losing their home, they're looking at the end of the year when the moratorium expires as this sort of looming deadline. They could very well find themselves in a situation where they have to pay several months' worth of back rent all in a lump sum, or face being kicked out.
It's hard, too, if you own the property, to have to be paying typically a mortgage on some of these places. So it's a lose-lose for everyone, really, right now. We know the CDC stepped in to ban evictions back in September that we're talking about because Congress could not agree on a new coronavirus stimulus package. Could we see the CDC step in again, you think?
It's certainly possible. Definitely housing advocacy groups, a lot of community groups are pushing for it. If you think about the public health justification that the CDC used back in September, to stop evictions as a way to halt the spread of coronavirus, if anything, that's so much more dire now. Of course, it's also possible that once Joe Biden takes office, he could put an eviction ban in place. But again, the current CDC ban runs out December 31st. Biden would not be inaugurated until late January. That leaves a gap of several weeks when we could potentially see a lot of evictions and a lot of problems happen.
Do we know, are eviction protections part of the discussion for a new stimulus package at this point?
It's certainly something that a lot of housing groups are pushing for at the time, just because there is this growing awareness that the economy, is not fully recovered. We're still down about 10 million jobs. We've seen initial unemployment claims actually rising for the past 2 weeks. More and more Americans have filed for unemployment. And then, of course, if Congress doesn't act, about 12 million people currently getting unemployment benefits would lose those benefits the day after Christmas. Something else that advocacy groups are pushing for, going back to your point about this payment cliff, Jamie, is beyond just banning evictions, they're asking to actually create rental assistance programs where they would relieve, renters from paying rent, they would relieve people's mortgages, or they would actually pay those funds. Even before the pandemic, half of American households said they couldn't come up with $500 in an emergency. So the idea that people would just be able to pay lump sums of thousands of dollars of back rent or mortgage payments is just not realistic.
Yeah, it doesn't seem possible at all. When you look here, what are the short and long-term impacts of millions of Americans being evicted?
Eviction is one of the most destabilizing things that can happen to a family. There's a lot of research showing people who go through an eviction are more likely to lose their jobs. They're more likely to get ill. Kids who go through that have a much harder time in school. They're more likely to drop out. They're more likely to interact with the criminal justice system. Having an eviction on your record just sticks around for so long, and it actually makes it much harder for people to find housing down the line for up to 10 years after an eviction. Even if somebody is employed, even if they have money to pay for several months' worth of rent, a lot of the time a landlord will just not rent to them if they have an eviction on their record. So if you multiply that across millions of people, this could be devastating for entire communities. And aside from just the human suffering, the human costs of this, there's also social costs. If you think about, millions of people potentially becoming homeless, there's emergency shelter costs, there's public health costs. People are much more likely to go to the ER for whatever reason. And thinking about it long term, a crisis like this could really hurt the ability of communities to just recover economically.
Oh, it's so stressful to think about, and we're just beginning, really. Irina Ivanova, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.